Okay, we'll get started. Really looking forward to talking about what is forest carbon. Why is everyone talking about this whole carbon thing? What does that mean for me? What is this NCX program? How can I get involved? We're really fortunate to have some folks here that have actually participated in our program. We do these annual programs, which we'll talk about. And it's really exciting. We're actually just wrapping up our first Southeast-wide program that folks got started in last year in April, and just wrapping that up now. And I'm going to send our first payments out to folks that did this harvest approach program. So it's really coming full circle, and then we'll take the trains back to the start and do it all again. So excited to sort of talk about the process to everybody. As I was saying, as I was getting started, before we became NCX, the Natural Capital Exchange, our company was called Sylvia Terra. And what we were doing as a company is we were using remote sensing, satellite imagery, and forest biometrics and data science to really reduce the cost of doing inventory projects for lots of different types of landowners. So we had clients that were TMOs, REITs, government institutions, large landowners, and just using science to help improve measurements and precision with forestry. As part of that, we did a lot of work with some of these earlier stage carbon markets. And folks have maybe heard about the cap and trade system based in California, some of the American Carbon Registry or California Air and Resources Board projects, and those were sort of what we call kind of forest carbon 1.0. That was typically looking at really big ownerships, long-term contracts, and there's a lot of inventory work that's part of that, and Sylvia Terra is doing the work to help with those inventory measurements. And we saw an opportunity to develop a program that worked more for all sorts of landowners, especially private forest landowners, which you don't need me to tell you this, but you all make up the biggest percentage of ownership in the U.S. is sort of different demographics and groups. Something like 38% of forest land in the U.S. is managed and owned by private forest landowners like themselves. So for something like the carbon markets, which we think are really just getting started, I think it's really important for us to be able to develop a program that works for folks like themselves. So it's hard to say, what is precision forestry? This is an example of some of the work that we can do using satellite imagery and forest biometrics. This is looking at forest types across the Southeast. This data really feeds a lot of the markets that we're now developing and implementing across the country. But I wanted to show this one because this is really where we got started with our program a year ago with these states in the Southeast. So you'll see other features like this later on. But I just wanted to share this one. So, as we heard,
can you speak up loud?
Oh, sorry. Speak up. Okay, sorry. You said like I'm booming. I want to make your ears bleed. Thanks for letting me know. Okay. None of that stuff I said before was important anyway. All right. Well, as we heard, the team that I lead is our U.S. origination team. So we're focused on engaging forest landowners in our program. It's always good to put a face to a name. We are a company that's got folks all across the country, as you can see if you can read where everyone's based here. But it's really nice that we're able to connect through webinars, and Zoom, and email, and phone, and stuff like that. But it's always good to put a face to a name, and we try to get to events like this as much as we can with our team. So today you've got me, and then Aiden's in the back here. Aiden just graduated from Wisconsin with a forestry degree. Started right out of school, so excited to have him on board with the team. And like I said, maybe folks that have worked with us before recognize some of these names and faces. So I want to take a second and just really zoom up to a high level and talk about what is forest carbon. So as you can see in this graph, and folks know this, but it's important to just sort of get all in on the basics. Trees sequester carbon as a function of just growth. Trees do this. There's all these sort of interesting technologies happening right now where companies are paying a lot of money to try to reduce their forest carbon, their carbon footprint, and pull carbon out of the atmosphere, because these are things that are causing changes in weather patterns and things like that. And companies want to try to pay for this type of thing to happen a lot. And trees do this naturally. They've been doing this for long before we were here. And what our program does is it tries to help landowners have a market where if they are able to be paid to keep their tree standing a little bit longer, they'll pull a little bit more carbon out of the atmosphere, which is something, as I said, people want to pay for. And so it sounds crazy to get paid to not do something, but really what our program is doing is helping landowners manage the costs of pushing out a harvest event. We've heard a lot of really good information about taxes and timing and how that all works. And this is another basically tool in your management toolbox where if you want to participate in this program, you can be paid to push out a harvest that you were going to undertake in the next 12 to 24 months and be paid to do that because as the trees grow, they pull more carbon out of the atmosphere, and that's something, again, that people are excited about paying for. So that's sort of the basics of a forest carbon program. How do we provide the incentives to change management to put a little bit more volume on the stump a year at a time, and that's also good for landowners that maybe want to wait out on a market cycle, or maybe jump a product class if they've got mostly pulpwood and want to get the chip and saw stuff. And there are reasons why you can't do that the way you might like to because you've got cash flow considerations that you're managing for with your management plan, and you can do what comes with the forester. But if our program can give folks the flexibility to participate in this new market opportunity and use that as a tool in their toolbox, that's something we're really excited about. So this is a bit more of a complicated chart, but it kind of explains how we do this. To be able to provide this opportunity to landowners, we need to know sort of what's the inventory on your property, what's merchantable, what's likely to be harvested in the next 12 to 24 months. And we can do that using a lot of the data science and analysis work that we've done over the last really decade. We've got really good at doing that. So we can understand just from satellite imagery and some ground measurements that help inform our estimates. We can understand the standing inventory on a property, and then we can use publicly available data to understand where are the mills located next to this property, where are the common haul roads near this property, can this landowner easily get this wood to market? If they're in Alabama, are they managing on a pretty aggressive rotation relative to what you might see in Wisconsin? There are different things that we know about different regions that allow us to inform pretty accurate predictions of what we think a typical management regime is going to look like on any given property. In Alabama, you're maybe looking at a first inning at 15, second inning, 22 years old, looking at a final harvest right around 28, 29, 30. Those are things that we can then build models around to help understand what a given property is probably going to look like, a year from now or 2 years from now. So to get enrolled in our program, and I'll walk through some screens that show this, and folks that have done this know it's fairly straightforward. We think we've really tried to make it streamlined and easy for folks. Don't want to have a bunch of paperwork get in the way of folks just kind of getting a sense of what this can mean for their property. But basically the way it works is you submit your property boundaries, you receive an estimate from us of what we think is the eligible volume of carbon to be sold into our market, and we'll talk about how that works a bit. As landowners, you have the opportunity to sort of name the price at which you'd be willing to push out a harvest activity and grow those trees a little bit bigger, generate some of those carbon credits that, those credits accrue when you're putting on more volume, sequestering more carbon than you would have otherwise if you sent that volume to the mill. And then we do this harvest deferral project, which is where we use some of the satellite imagery and ground measurements and remote sensing to just sort of monitor the changes in inventory over the 1 year period relative to what we thought would have happened in the absence of our program, where maybe you would have conducted a harvest and removed some of that volume, remove the carbon from the property, if you will. And then at the end of the project, landowners get paid once we're able to verify that the volume that was meant to be there is still there. And then you can either harvest or you can re-enroll in the program. It kind of depends on where you're at in your management, what your objectives are. As we hear often in forestry, it depends. And so this is another nice thing about our program with the 1 year terms, that you have flexibility to move around. So these, as I said, a couple screenshots I'll go through quickly. And we have some training videos on our website to help walk through this process. But as I said, probably the biggest thing to do to get started with our program is to go onto our website, and we have folks like Aiden that can help you get through this process. Selecting your property boundaries, that allows us to start to get a sense of the inventory and the markets available to you as a landowner. This is how you do. This actually, I think this property is, I can't remember exactly, this might be in Maine actually. It's the last time we did this presentation, I was in Maine and I forgot about this description. But Same idea, tax parcels, we rely on that as a data set. We also allow folks to submit shapefile if they have them. I think Unscan actually has a pretty great sort of export function that allows folks to draw their property boundaries in the app. They can actually export that as a shapefile and upload it using our program. So we'll see that if you're familiar. And then you read through some documentation on our website, and then you request an assessment. When you get that assessment, what we're basically doing is we're sharing with you what we think is the inventory and the merchantable inventory on property and what we thought was going to be harvested in the next 12 to 24 months in terms of volume. And we associate that with the carbon content stored in trees. Folks that know a little bit about forestry and science and forest science, they'll know that different species have different carbon contents based on their density and all that, and that's something that we take into account. So, zooming out a little bit, I've talked about the one-year contract and the annual nature of what we're doing and why that's different, and we think the more works better for more landowners that aren't maybe excited about signing a 50-year-long or 100-year-long contract. We like to joke that the only contract that should be that long should be your marriage. Every other contract feels like we probably don't need to be that long. The enrollment fees, as I've talked through this, you can see we're using a lot of satellite imagery and technology that allows us to administer our program without having to do a ton of on-the-ground measurements. We still do some measurements. We send out cruisers and properties. We work with a lot of great foresters across the country that help with that. But we're able to augment our program using remote sensing, which brings the cost down, which means that we can offer this program to landowners at zero cost or $0 to enroll, which is quite a bit different than some of the other carbon programs that exist, where you might be spending upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars just on the measurements alone. You make that back, or they basically make that back into carbon payments, but it's a pretty big financial decision. Folks always want to know what, okay, well, this all sounds great, but what is the cost? What do I get paid at the end of the day? That'll vary, again, back to that common phrase, it depends. Depends on your property, it depends on the volume on your property, how, what's the stocking level, what are the markets like? If you've got a bunch of really solid looking timber, but you don't have a market to sell it into, the likelihood is that you weren't going to harvest it because you don't have a market to sell it into. And we take that into account. If you're 200 miles from the nearest sawmill, it's going to cost you a lot to get the logs there. So we have to take that into account when we are trying to predict that harvest likelihood. Now I'll show a screen that shows that pretty well. But anyway, all that being said, the typical payments we've seen so far in the last year are around $3 to $10 per acre. And again, that'll really vary, but that kind of gives you a sense of what we're looking at. Folks have kind of compared it to another hunting lease. Helps cover your property taxes. Those are kinds of that's sort of the range you're looking at as far as what we're talking about here on the annual payment. So I said we were going to see some cool maps again. This is base map for Alabama. And so folks that have seen species maps for the state, hopefully will recognize. We've got a legend here in the bottom right corner. But just to sort of talk a little bit more in detail about how this comes together, we use a lot of different publicly available data, some that we pay for, some that's free, and we use the Forest Service FIA data to help us with the ground measurements. We use the National Land Cover data set, which is an important part of our determination of forest versus non-forest land. And then, as I said, a lot of ground measurements that help inform this. And so this is a really big part of. Is that better? Should I be
yes.
In there?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Sorry. The base map is really sort of the core of how we're able to do a lot of this. And this is really the work that we did over the last sort of 10 years or so. So I said I was going to show an example of what it means to be at a property level able to try to look at the harvest likelihood and how that looks across the county. This is a county in Pennsylvania where we ran a pilot program back in 2020 with about 20 landowners. But this just shows sort of how we look at, depending on stocking, size of the property, access to markets. The darker red parcels are where we would predict a higher likelihood of harvest and more sort of carbon at risk, if you will. Carbon that's going to be removed from the landscape. Those trees are not going to be able to stay on the ground, put on a little more volume and sequester more carbon. So this is just a good example that sort of helps you think about how our program would assess different properties differently, despite them potentially being next door to each other. Because we know that if you look at the landscape level, harvests are popping up all the time. It's not just sort of uniformly managed, and so our ability to have property level baselines allows us to do high quality, precise measurements for any property that involves in our program. Which is important because if you're trying to do this at the scale that NCX is doing it, you need to be able to do this at a really wide scale, efficiently with landowners in lots of different markets, different regions, different forest types. And so this is a map of all the properties that we assessed at the end of last year in our winter cycle. We do these quarterly enrollment events where we get folks signed up, they get their assessment reports, and then they can decide if they want to participate. And so we had a lot of action down here in Alabama. We had, I think, landowners in every single county in Mississippi enroll, which was really exciting. And so yeah, if you look at this map and you look at something like forest, they have a lot of really interesting mill and land acquisition data. You kind of see that the carbon markets are kind of happening where the timber harvesting is happening, which makes sense because, as we talked about earlier, for these programs to really create a change versus a business as usual management scenario, you kind of need to be where the harvesting is happening, and that's what we're seeing with our participation. And since January of last year, we've had over 750 landowners in Alabama sign up for an assessment, and a little over 300 have signed up, and some of them are in this room, which is really cool for us to meet in person. Some over 300 have signed up to further harvesting for the year, and then maybe consider participating again in the future. I'll go through this one really quickly. Folks that are maybe more familiar with forest carbon markets know that certification, this isn't forest certification, this is carbon methodology certification. This is a really important step for any program. So NCX is really excited to be working with the Vera Carbon Standard Group. They are a third-party private organization. It's not a government thing. They're just another organization out there that the folks that buy these credits want to know that the third party is accounting and make sure that the folks at NCX are doing their math right and it all pencils out. And so we're going through that process right now in our full written methodology, which is about a, I think, 50-page document. It's pretty dense, but if you want to read it, it's on our website. Welcome to. We also publish some other guides that help sort of put it in layperson terms. That methodology is public review now, which is really exciting. We expect to sort of have that whole process with them wrapped up in probably the fall, so October, November timeframe. Almost wrapped up here. One thing I do really want to call out is the role of consulting foresters, or foresters in general, with our program. As I mentioned earlier, this is a tool in your management toolbox, and there's no better person than a forester to help think through the implications of pushing out a harvest, both from an economic perspective, but also from a forest health perspective. And what are your objectives that you're trying to achieve over the long term? And how does a forest carbon program like ours, where you're pushing out that harvest by a year or two, or however long you want to participate in the program, how does that factor in at the broader scale of what you're trying to do on your property? So if you work with a forester, absolutely recommend that you strongly encourage you bring them into the discussion. In many cases, you may have heard about the program from the forester, because we try to do a lot to educate consultants and other foresters about our program so that they can determine which of their clients might be a good fit for a carbon program like ours. As the slide says, more than 40% of participants in our program are represented by a forester, and we've invested a lot of time and energy in engaging with consultants, doing webinars. We've developed different sort of online tools for them to help manage their clients. We also benefit a lot at NCX from getting to work with foresters in different parts of the country to learn more about the local market context that is really important for me to show that our program remains high quality and really credible as we grow across the country. And some of the folks on the team that we showed pictures of are foresters. They worked in procurement in the past, or consulting foresters in the past, and as we continue to grow our team, we'll be making sure that we have a lot of that forester representation amongst the group, because it's really important to have that context for the broader picture of the forest ownership and management. So this is my last slide. Talked a lot about carbon today. The reason we went from Sylvia Terra to the Natural Capital Exchange and not Sylvia Terra to Sylvia Terra Carbon or something like that is because we really believe that beyond just carbon, there are other things other ecosystem services and values that forests provide to society. And the whole thesis of our company is that forests have, for a long time, been undervalued, and that landowners are only able to get paid for timber, which is a really important and will continue to be an extremely important thing that forests provide to society. If you read the news, you know that everybody feels like every state has some sort of or another housing crisis, but we need to build more houses. That wood needs to come from somewhere. It'll come from places like Alabama. But we know that there are other values that forests provide, and again, you don't need me to tell you this, but wildlife habitat, water quality, recreational benefits, biodiversity, wildfire risk reduction out in the West, where I'm based in California. Good management can make all of these things more prevalent on the landscape. And what we're really excited about at NCX is we have the measurements and capabilities to create markets for this stuff, and then engage landowners and then corporations on the buyer side that want to help basically fund these changes at the landscape level. And we know when we talk to landowners that they like the private market approach here because we try to keep the paperwork minimum and just sort of do this in a really efficient way. And so just to give you a sense of where we hope to be going in the next 5 to 10 years is, and sooner in some cases, with reforestation, afforestation, wildlife habitat development. These are things that we're actively working on beyond just the forest carbon piece. So maybe next time we're here at the meeting next year, hopefully we'll be able to talk more about that. But right now we're pretty focused on carbon. So. All right, so I think I'll have some time for Q&A. And apologies that I think I was talking a little quietly at the beginning. So if you missed anything, fire away. Thanks for having us. Right here.
For there to be a value in the carbon, you've shown values of $3 to $10 per acre per year. There must be a cost to enrolling in a program, which is the deferred harvest part of it.
That's right.
Do you help your clients gauge what the cost is to not cutting trees in order to compare what the net benefit there is to your customer?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, does NCX help provide guidance with landowners on how to think about the opportunity cost of delaying harvest? Because there is a cost. You're pushing out that cash flow by a year. Folks familiar with the concept of net present value know that having that cash today is better, and there's a cost of not having it today. And we do some webinars and workshops with landowners to help them think through that economic cost. And it's an important part of the decision calculus on. And then that's where I talked about the ability to pick your price, because different landowners will have different opportunities, different bids that they're considering for their timber, and so the price that they're willing to defer at could differ from person down the road. And so we try to give folks a lot of guidance on how to think about that.